I was standing in the conference room when Director Paul Hendricks walked past me like I was furniture. "Tara won't be joining us for the deadline review," he announced to the senior team, that smug grin spreading across his face. "She creates unnecessary tension in these meetings." The room went silent for a beat. A few people glanced at me. Then he laughed, and they laughed with him, and just like that, I was dismissed from the most critical planning session of the quarter. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I walked out, closed my office door, and sat down at my desk. But here's what Paul didn't know yet: in 3 days, his entire division would collapse, and he'd come running to me begging for answers he'd already thrown away. Why did the VP's expression change when Paul confirmed I wasn't involved in the review? Why did she lean forward and ask, twice, whether I'd been consulted on the timeline? Paul brushed it off. He had no idea what that question meant. Let me take you back 18 months. Shooting Star Technologies had just acquired a smaller firm, and the merger brought a flood of new processes, teams, and egos. I'd been with the company for 7 years at that point, working in project coordination, the kind of role people think is administrative until something goes wrong. I tracked dependencies. I mapped workflows across departments. I knew which teams were bottlenecked, which managers overpromised, and which deadlines were fantasy. Paul Hendricks joined as Director of Operations after the acquisition. He came from a consulting background, the kind of guy who thought frameworks and charisma could replace institutional knowledge. From day one, he made it clear he found my caution irritating. When I flagged risks and project timelines, he'd wave me off. "We need solution-oriented thinking, not problem-focused negativity," he'd say in meetings, looking around for nods of approval. He got them. I was the person pointing out that the emperor had no clothes, and nobody wants to hear that when the emperor is charming and confident and 3 levels above you on the org chart. The division I worked in handled product launches, the coordination of engineering, marketing, legal, and sales to get new features and tools to market. It was complex, high-stakes work with regulatory deadlines, partner commitments, and revenue projections tied to every date. Miss a cutoff, and you miss a quarter. Miss a quarter, and you lose contracts worth millions. Paul didn't understand the machinery. He understood optics. He ran meetings like TED Talks, full of energy and vision and almost no substance. He'd set aggressive deadlines in front of executives, then leave it to people like me to figure out whether they were even possible. When I warned him we didn't have capacity for 3 simultaneous launches, he accused me of being risk-averse. When I showed him dependency maps proving the bottlenecks, he said I was overcomplicating things. The first major project under Paul's leadership had been a product refresh that should have taken 4 months. He promised it in 6 weeks. I'd pulled him aside after that meeting, shown him the resource allocation spreadsheet, explained that engineering alone needed 8 weeks for the technical build-out. He'd looked at me like I'd told him the sky was green. "Tara, this is why you're not in leadership," he'd said. "Leaders inspire teams to exceed expectations. You're setting artificial limits." That product launched 3 months late. By then, Paul had already moved the goalposts, blamed engineering for scope creep, and positioned himself as the hero who salvaged a troubled project. Nobody remembered his 6-week promise except me and my spreadsheets. The second project went similarly. Paul announced an aggressive timeline to the executive team, collected praise for his ambition, then watched as reality slowly dismantled his plan. Each time, he'd find someone else to blame. The engineering lead was too cautious. The marketing team wasn't agile enough. The legal department was creating unnecessary roadblocks. Never Paul. Never the timelines that ignored basic operational constraints. I stopped pushing back in public. I documented everything instead. Every ignored warning, every override of my recommendations, every time he dismissed a concern I raised. I kept spreadsheets of what I'd predicted versus what actually happened. I tracked delays he caused by cutting corners or ignoring cross-team requirements. I didn't do this out of spite. I did it because I knew someone would eventually need the truth, and I wanted to be ready. Over those 18 months, Paul built a reputation as a dynamic leader while quietly eroding the division's operational integrity. He hired people who agreed with him, sidelined people who questioned him, and took credit for launches that succeeded despite his interference. His inner circle called themselves the Innovation Squad, a group of mid-level managers who prioritized speed over accuracy and celebrated moving fast even when they were moving in the wrong direction. Meanwhile, I kept my head down and did my job. I made sure timelines were realistic where I had control. I maintained relationships with team leads who still trusted my judgment. I became the person people quietly consulted when they needed to know what was actually going on, even as Paul positioned me as the problem. I remember one particularly telling moment about 4 months before the deadline disaster. We were in a division-wide meeting, and Paul was presenting his vision for streamlining our processes. "We're going to cut approval cycles in half," he announced. "Too many checkpoints slow us down. We need to empower teams to move faster." I raised my hand. "Which checkpoints specifically?" He frowned. "All the redundant ones." "Can you give an example?" I pressed. "Because each approval stage exists for a reason, usually compliance or risk management." The room shifted uncomfortably. Paul's smile tightened. "This is exactly the kind of resistance to change that holds organizations back," he said, gesturing at me like I was a case study. "We need people who ask, 'How can we make this work?' instead of 'Why won't this work?'" A few people nodded. Paul moved on. 3 weeks later, his streamlined process resulted in a product launch that violated 2 regulatory requirements because the compliance checkpoints had been removed. Legal had to pull the product from the market within 48 hours. The company paid a fine. Paul blamed the legal team for not catching it sooner. I still had the meeting notes where I'd flagged exactly which checkpoints were legally required. The culture Paul created was insidious. It wasn't just that he dismissed operational concerns, he made it socially costly to raise them. If you pointed out a flaw in his timeline, you were labeled as negative. If you insisted on following proper process, you were bureaucratic. If you asked for data to support his projections, you lacked vision. He'd built an environment where the appearance of agreement mattered more than the substance of decisions. And it worked, for a while. Because executives saw energy and momentum. They saw someone who took charge and made things happen. What they didn't see was the team leads working nights to fix the problems Paul created, the engineers building in secret buffer time because they knew his deadlines were fantasy, the operations people like me quietly preventing disasters while getting no credit. Then came the deadline review meeting. This was the big one, a quarterly planning session where we locked in commitments for 3 major product launches, all tied to a regulatory filing cutoff in 72 hours. The cutoff wasn't flexible. It was set by an external agency, and if we missed it, those products couldn't go to market for another 6 months. The revenue impact would be catastrophic. We were talking about contracts with enterprise clients, partnerships with major distributors, and projections that had been promised to the board. Paul decided I created too much tension. What he meant was, I asked questions he couldn't answer. I pointed out dependencies he didn't want to acknowledge. I made him look less in control. So he excluded me, framed it as a joke, and proceeded without the one person who actually understood how all the pieces fit together. I went back to my desk and waited. I knew what was coming. Paul ran that meeting like a victory lap. He presented the timeline to senior leadership, glossed over the coordination requirements, and assured everyone that his team had it handled. The VP had asked about my absence, but he'd deflected smoothly. "Tara's great at details, but for strategic discussions, I prefer a smaller group," he'd said. That's what someone told me later. He made it sound reasonable. He always did. But here's what Paul didn't know. 2 of the 3 product launches depended on a shared compliance review that had to be completed before submission. That review required sign-off from legal, engineering, and an external auditing firm. The auditing firm had a 3-day processing window, which meant the materials had to reach them no later than end-of-day Monday to meet the Thursday cutoff. Paul's timeline had the materials going out Wednesday. Because he didn't understand the process. Because he didn't ask. Because the person who knew had been excluded from the room. There was more. The 3rd product launch required integration testing with a partner company's systems. That partner had a change freeze starting Tuesday for their own compliance cycle. Paul's timeline had testing scheduled for Wednesday and Thursday. It was impossible. The partner systems would be locked. I negotiated the testing window weeks ago and had it scheduled for the previous Friday through Monday. But Paul's team had rescheduled it without consulting me, apparently deciding the original timeline had too much buffer. I had all of this in my project tracker. I had emails confirming the auditing firm's processing requirements. I had the partner company's change-free schedule in writing. I had dependency maps showing how each piece connected to the others. I'd presented all of it in the prep meeting 3 weeks earlier, the one Paul had attended but apparently hadn't listened to. I didn't have to do anything. I just watched. Monday came and went. I saw the emails starting to circulate, the urgent requests for status updates, the confusion about why things weren't moving. By Tuesday morning, the panic had set in. Engineering hadn't realized legal needed their documents 2 days earlier. Legal hadn't realized the auditing firm required additional verification that took 48 hours to produce. Marketing had prepared materials for a launch date that was now impossible. And the partner company had politely informed us that their systems were frozen and testing would have to wait until the following week, well after our regulatory cutoff. I received no fewer than 15 messages on Tuesday alone from various team members asking if I knew what was happening, whether the timeline had always been this tight, if there was any way to salvage the situation. I responded factually to each one. Yes, the timeline had always been tight. No, there was no buffer in the current plan. Yes, I had flagged these issues in the prep meeting. No, I had not been included in the final review. Tuesday afternoon, Paul appeared in my doorway. His face was pale. His confidence had evaporated. The innovation squad wasn't with him. "Tara," he said, voice tight, "I need you to look at something." I looked up from my screen. "What's wrong?" "The product launches," he said, stepping into my office and closing the door. "There's some kind of coordination issue. The timeline isn't working." "What timeline?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. He pulled out his laptop, showed me the plan he'd presented to leadership. I scanned it, already knowing every mistake. "When did you send the compliance materials to the auditing firm?" I asked. "We're sending them tomorrow," he said. "Wednesday morning." "The cutoff is Thursday," I said slowly. "The firm needs 3 business days to process." The color drained completely from his face. 3 days? "Yes," I said. "Which means the materials needed to go out Friday at the latest." I flagged this in my notes from the prep meeting 3 weeks ago. The one I wasn't invited to last week. He stared at me. "Can we expedite it?" "No," I said. "They don't do rush processing for regulatory work. It's in the contract." "What about the partner integration testing?" he asked, scrambling now. "Their systems are in change freeze until next week," I said. "I had testing scheduled for last Friday through Monday, but your team moved it without consulting me." Paul's hands were shaking slightly as he closed the laptop. "What do we do?" I leaned back in my chair. "You have 2 options. 1, you miss the deadline and push the launches to next quarter. 2, you go to the VP, explain what happened, and see if she can pull strings at the executive level to get an extension from the regulatory agency. That's unlikely, but it's your only shot." He looked at me like I'd just told him his career was over. Which, in a way, I had. "Why didn't anyone catch this?" he asked, and I could hear the desperation. "I caught it," I said quietly. "You excluded me from the review." He left my office without another word. By Wednesday morning, it was chaos. The VP called an emergency meeting. The division heads were pulled in. Paul tried to frame it as an unexpected coordination failure, something that slipped through the cracks. But the VP wasn't buying it. She'd been in operations for 20 years. She knew what a properly planned launch looked like, and this wasn't it. "Where's the dependency map?" she asked, looking around the table. Silence. "Who coordinated the cross-team requirements?" More silence. Her eyes landed on Paul. "You ran the deadline review. Who did you have managing the operational timeline?" Paul hesitated. "My team handled it internally." "Your team," the VP repeated. "Not your project coordinator?" "Tara wasn't in the final review," Paul admitted. "I felt we had the strategic pieces covered." The VP's expression didn't change, but the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. "The strategic pieces," she said. "Paul, regulatory compliance isn't strategic. It's operational. It's the foundation everything else rests on." She turned to her assistant. "Get Tara in here." I walked into that conference room 5 minutes later. Every senior leader in the division was there. Paul was sitting at the far end of the table, looking like he wanted to disappear. The VP gestured to an open seat. Tara, can you walk us through what happened with the compliance timeline? I did. I pulled up my notes from every planning meeting, showed them the dependency maps I created and shared weeks ago, pointed out the specific warnings I'd given about the auditing firm's processing window. I explained the coordination requirements Paul's team had missed, the sign-offs that hadn't been secured, the materials that hadn't been prepared in time. I showed them the email chain where I'd negotiated the partner testing window and the subsequent message where Paul's team had moved it without understanding the constraints. I wasn't gloating. I wasn't emotional. I just presented the facts, the same way I always did. The VP listened without interrupting. When I finished, she sat back and looked at Paul. You excluded the person who understood the process, then blamed the process when it failed. Paul tried to recover. I take responsibility for the oversight. We'll regroup and make sure this doesn't happen again. No, the VP said. You'll be working with HR on a transition plan. Effective immediately, Tara will be managing all operational planning for product launches. You'll report to her until we determine your next role. The room went silent. Paul's face turned red. You're putting her in charge? I'm putting the person who knows how to do the job in charge, the VP said. You're lucky I'm not terminating you outright. 3 product launches, millions in revenue, all jeopardized because you didn't like someone's tone in meetings. She stood up. We're done here. The hallway conversation afterward was brief but illuminating. 2 members of Paul's innovation squad intercepted me outside the conference room. One of them, a marketing manager named Ian, looked genuinely shaken. We didn't know about the auditing timeline, he said. Paul told us you were being overly cautious about the dates. I sent the timeline to the full team 3 weeks ago, I said. He said you were padding the schedule, the other one, a product manager named Stephanie, admitted. He told us real leaders trim the fat and push teams to perform. I looked at both of them. Did either of you verify that with the auditing firm? Or the partner company? Or legal? They hadn't. Of course they hadn't. They'd trusted Paul's interpretation over the documented facts because Paul was confident and I was careful, and in their minds, confident always beat careful. You might want to start checking primary sources, I said. Especially when millions of dollars are on the line. Paul didn't last another month. He was reassigned to a strategy role with no direct reports, essentially a demotion disguised as a lateral move. His innovation squad quietly disbanded, its members suddenly very interested in understanding operational processes. Within 3 months, Paul left the company entirely. I heard through the grapevine that he struggled to find another director-level position. Turns out, when people call your references and ask about operational competence, and your most recent disaster is public knowledge, the charisma doesn't carry as much weight. The division spent the next quarter rebuilding. I worked with the VP to implement a new planning process, one that required cross-functional input at every stage and made it impossible for anyone to override operational requirements for the sake of optics. We instituted mandatory review sessions where operational coordinators had veto power over timelines that violated known constraints. We created escalation paths that bypassed individual directors and went straight to the VP if someone tried to suppress operational concerns. The launches Paul had derailed eventually went forward, delayed but successful. The company absorbed the revenue loss, and everyone learned a very expensive lesson about the difference between leadership and performance. I got promoted 6 months later. Not to Paul's old role, which was restructured out of existence, but to a newly created position, Director of Program Integration. I reported directly to the VP. My job was to do exactly what I'd always done, but now with the authority to enforce it. The teams I'd been quietly supporting for years suddenly had official channels to raise concerns. The managers who used to dismiss my input now had to incorporate it into their plans. I built a team of 5 coordinators, people who understood that the unglamorous work of tracking dependencies and managing timelines was what kept everything else running. We became the backbone of every major initiative in the division. When executives proposed aggressive deadlines, they called us first. When product teams pitched new launches, they ran them through our process. We weren't flashy. We didn't give TED Talks. But we made sure things worked. My first major initiative as director was creating what we called the reality check framework. Every proposed project had to pass through a structured review where operational coordinators mapped out dependencies, identified regulatory requirements, confirmed resource availability, and verified external partner constraints. The framework had built-in buffer calculations based on historical data, and it flagged any timeline that compressed critical paths beyond safe limits. The executives hated it at first. "This is going to slow everything down," one of them complained in a leadership meeting. "No," the VP said, looking directly at him. "It's going to prevent us from committing to timelines we can't meet and then scrambling to explain why we failed. Unless you'd like to repeat last quarter's disaster?" Nobody argued after that. The framework worked because it was transparent. Project managers could see exactly why a timeline was or wasn't feasible. If they wanted to compress the schedule, they had to identify which dependencies they were willing to cut or which resources they'd add to maintain safety margins. It turned timeline negotiations from political battles into math problems. You can't charm your way around a 3-day processing requirement or a partner's change freeze. Within 6 months, our on-time delivery rate went from 62% to 94%. Customer satisfaction improved. Partner relationships stabilized because we stopped promising things we couldn't deliver. Revenue projections became reliable because they were based on achievable timelines instead of wishful thinking. The recognition came gradually. Industry publications started writing about Shooting Star's operational turnaround. I was invited to speak on panels about cross-functional coordination and risk management. Other companies reached out asking to learn from our processes. The work I'd been doing in obscurity for years was suddenly visible, not because I'd changed what I did, but because people were finally paying attention. One particular conference panel stands out in my memory. I was speaking alongside several other operations leaders about preventing project failures. Someone in the audience asked how we handled resistant executives who wanted to override operational constraints. "You document everything," I said. "You present the facts clearly. And if they override you anyway, you make sure there's a record of what you recommended and what they chose instead." Eventually, reality catches up with bad decisions, and when it does, the truth matters. Another panelist, a woman who'd led operations at a major tech company, nodded emphatically. "The thing people don't understand," she added, "is that operational leaders aren't being difficult when we flag risks. We're doing our jobs. If executives want to take calculated risks, fine, but they need to understand what they're calculating." That resonated with the audience because it resonated with reality. How many careers had been derailed because someone raised a concern that later proved correct, but by then the person who dismissed them had moved on or rewritten the narrative? Paul sent me a LinkedIn message about a year after he left. It was short, awkward, something about how he'd been reflecting on his time at Shooting Star and realized he should have listened more. He didn't apologize outright, but it was close enough. I didn't respond. What was there to say? His failure had become my opportunity, and I'd moved on. But I did think about what his message represented. Paul wasn't a villain in a simple story. He was someone who'd succeeded in environments that rewarded competence over competence, speed over accuracy, and charisma over expertise. He'd learned that if you could sell a vision convincingly enough, people would overlook whether you could execute it. That worked until he encountered a problem that couldn't be solved with presentation skills, and by then he'd alienated everyone who could have helped him. There's a broader lesson there about corporate culture and what we choose to reward. For every Paul who crashes spectacularly, there are dozens who muddle through, creating inefficiency and frustration while maintaining their reputations. They succeed because organizations often struggle to distinguish between people who get things done and people who look like they're getting things done. The real shift happened in how I saw my own value. For years, I'd internalized the idea that being cautious, detail-oriented, and process-focused made me difficult. That my insistence on doing things correctly was a personality flaw. Paul's implosion didn't just vindicate my approach, it clarified that the problem had never been me. The problem was people who mistook competence for competence and punished anyone who challenged that confusion. I stopped trying to soften my delivery or apologize for asking hard questions. I stopped worrying about whether people found me agreeable. I focused on building systems that worked and protecting the people who did the unglamorous, essential work that kept those systems running. I found that when you lead with competence instead of charisma, the right people follow you anyway. My team became the division's most requested resource. We had a waiting list for projects. Other departments started asking if we could expand our scope. The VP gave us budget for tools and training. We weren't just tolerated, we were valued, because everyone had learned the hard way what happened when we weren't involved. One of my team members, a coordinator named Felicity who'd been with the company for 3 years, came to me about 8 months into my new role. "I need to tell you something," she said, closing my office door. "When Paul was running things, I almost quit. I thought maybe I wasn't cut out for this work because every time I flagged a problem, I was told I was being negative. It made me question whether I was actually good at my job or just pessimistic." "You're excellent at your job," I told her. That's exactly why Paul's approach was so damaging. It didn't just create operational failures, it made competent people doubt themselves. "I know that now," she said. "But I wanted you to know that what you built here, this team and this process, it's not just about better project outcomes. It's about showing people that doing the work right matters more than looking good while doing it wrong." That conversation stayed with me because it highlighted something I hadn't fully articulated before. The damage Paul caused wasn't just measured in missed deadlines and lost revenue. It was measured in the talented people who second-guessed their expertise, who left the company, who learned to stay quiet rather than face dismissal for being right. Building a healthy operational culture meant creating space for people to raise concerns without fear, to insist on proper process without being labeled difficult, to value accuracy over agility when accuracy was what the situation required. It meant promoting people based on results rather than presentation skills, and recognizing that the person who prevents a disaster deserves as much credit as the person who appears to solve one. I think about that day Paul excluded me from the meeting sometimes. How certain he was that I was the problem. How easily he convinced others that my caution was negativity, my thoroughness was tension. He genuinely believed that removing me would make things run more smoothly. And in a way, it did, for about 3 days. Then reality caught up. That's the thing about operational work. You can ignore it, dismiss the people who do it, pretend it's less important than vision and strategy. But eventually, the machinery breaks down. And when it does, no amount of charm or competence can put it back together. You need someone who actually knows how it works. I was that person. I'd always been that person. Paul just couldn't see it until it was too late. The deadline he missed cost the company millions. The reputation damage took quarters to repair. The leadership shakeup created instability that rippled through the division for a year. All of that could have been avoided if he'd included me in one meeting. If he'd asked one question. If he'd valued competence over comfort. He didn't, and it destroyed him. I don't take pleasure in that, not really. What I take satisfaction in is the vindication of the work itself. The proof that the things I'd been saying for years weren't negativity or tension, they were accurate. The validation that the skills I'd been dismissed for were exactly what the company needed. The recognition that doing your job correctly, even when it's inconvenient for others, is worth more than any amount of likability. Today, I lead a team that prevents disasters instead of cleaning them up. We're the people who make sure deadlines are realistic, dependencies are tracked, and risks are addressed before they become catastrophes. We're not the ones giving inspiring speeches at company events. We're the ones making sure there's a company left to have events for. And when someone proposes a plan that won't work, when they dismiss concerns or rush past critical details, I speak up. Every time. Not because I enjoy conflict, but because I've seen what happens when competent people stay silent to avoid being labeled difficult. They get excluded from the meeting. Then they watch everything fall apart. Then they get blamed for not preventing the disaster they warned about. I don't play that game anymore. Paul thought he could succeed by sidelining the people who made him uncomfortable. He built his reputation on minimizing risk instead of managing it, on selling confidence instead of earning it. It worked until it didn't. Until the one time he couldn't afford a failure, and he'd already pushed away everyone who could have helped him avoid it. That's not bad luck. That's consequences. The people who stayed, the ones who value substance over style, who respect expertise even when it challenges them, those are the people I work with now. We built something real together, something that doesn't collapse the moment someone asks a hard question. We created a culture where being right matters more than being agreeable, where protecting the work means more than protecting egos. Paul's failure was his own. But my success? That came from years of showing up, doing the job correctly, and refusing to apologize for knowing what I was doing. It came from building relationships with people who recognized competence when they saw it. It came from documenting everything, staying ready, and trusting that eventually, the truth would matter. It did. 3 days after he laughed me out of the room, he came back panicked, asking why everything had fallen apart. I told him exactly why. Because the person who understood the system wasn't allowed to protect it. He learned that lesson the hard way. I hope he remembers it. I know I'll never forget.